Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Earl Lewis, and I am the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, as well as the Director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. And we are delighted that you have decided to join us for this evening's program, City on the Edge, Ypsilanti, African Americans, and the World of Work. It gives us an opportunity to have a conversation with my friend and colleague, Dr. Al Young, who's the author of the recently published book, From the Edge of the Ghetto, African Americans and the World of Work. And in fact, many of you know Al. He's been a faculty member at the University of Michigan now for more than 2 decades. But for those who don't, Alford A. Young Jr. is the Edward G. Epps Collegiate Professor of Sociology, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy. He's a well-known author for working on the history, the sociology of Black men. His first book, The Mind of Marginalized Black Men, Making Sense of Mobility, Opportunity, and Future Life Chances, was an important milestone in talking about what it meant to live both in urban areas and in the urban context. His more recent books sort of pick up on that theme, Are Black Men Doomed? 2019 work. And this one sort of deals with more recent book, the lives not only of Black men, but Black men and Black women, as we think about what constitutes a working life in America and what it means to be on the margins in some ways of certain aspects of socioeconomic progress. And so we're delighted that Al has agreed to spend some time and be in conversation with us. We've been trying to get at this since last spring. And COVID has sort of been our foe, but we finally figured out a platform, an evening and a time to have this conversation. This is a program in 2 parts. The first part will be Al and myself talking for about 20 minutes or so about the book and raising some questions. And then the second part, which will go on through the remainder of the program, will feature a moderated session headed by Professor Carla O'Connor, who will include also Professor Luke Schaefer and Mr. Derek Jackson, who will be engaging with Al about aspects of the book and the issues and questions that he poses in it. Before we start, I want a little housekeeping here and really thank the co-sponsors who've made this evening possible. From the University of Michigan, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, and the National Center for Institutional Diversity, and from the broader community, the YMCA. We thank you for your help and aid in making this program work for us all. From our staff at the center, Doreen Tinaharo and Victoria Fisher have been extraordinarily purposeful in making sure that we not only had an event, but we had this event that makes it possible for you to engage with the issues that are before us. We realize that many of you will have questions and questions that won't be answered perhaps directly. So what we're going to do is ask that you use and then the chat feature in which we're capturing, and that we will then actually create a blog after this event where Professor Young and the other members of the panel tonight will engage in direct conversation, and we will publish this on our website at the center. And so we will make sure that your questions get answered, even if we don't have the format that allows you to pose the question directly. So with that, we want to say, let's sit back and Al, this is your show, so let's start a conversation. And welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for participating this evening.
So you've done a lot of work in other settings. Why Ypsilanti? Why this setting? First, let me start there.
Well, I have to say, in all honesty, the project came to me in an indirect manner, and I'm so grateful that it did. But my pathway to Ypsilanti was actually what I thought was going to be a pathway to Detroit. I was very interested in tackling the issue of African Americans and their visions of work and work opportunity in what is arguably the most important industrial city in America for looking at such issues. And so I thought the best way to get there was to do some preliminary work in Ypsilanti to make sure my questions made sense, to make sure the issues that I was getting at were appropriate. And I came to find that there was indeed an Ypsilanti story to tell. And that was on the backdrop of the fact that I had already had some exposure to Ypsilanti. When I came to Ann Arbor, when I first moved to the city, as I was trying to make sense of the African-American experience in Southeastern Michigan and African-American culture, so many people pointed me to Ypsilanti. It was a place I first went to get haircuts and to engage in the kinds of things that Black men would find of interest when they moved to a residential space. So the city had already served an important role for me to sort of ground me in some ways around Black culture, around the Black experience. And then when I got there and started doing research, I realized that there was an important small city story to tell. And so I cast down my buckets, as the saying goes, in that city and began to do some work there.
Thank you. So for those who have not had a chance to read the book, tell us and tell them a little bit, what is this book about? What are you arguing in this book?
Well, there were a couple of arguments, and it points to the fact that there are a lot of stories to tell about a small city. The first builds off of what I've just said. It's a vision of how African Americans think about work and work opportunity. But what's unique about Ypsilanti, and even in comparison to some other small cities in America, is that it is geographically and culturally caught in between some very different spaces. So it neighbors Ann Arbor, one of the hallmarks of post-industrial small city living in America.
Mm-hmm.
It is an extension of Detroit to the extent that the automobile industry, that which gave rise to the industrial order in Detroit, spilled over in Ypsilanti. And indeed, much of the appeal for Ypsilanti throughout the 20th century was the opportunity to engage manufacturing, automobile manufacturing in particular, and find opportunity. And so here I was in this space where, although people lived in a small city, they were caught between two different economies and two different social worlds. And I came to realize that there was a fascinating story to tell. What does it mean to quite literally be on the doorstep of post-industrial living, of life in a city that is driven by research, technology, and development like Ann Arbor, but in some ways to be so culturally connected to Detroit and so tied to that industrial sphere that was so promising so long ago and so difficult to navigate today.
And so a little bit about the individuals that you spent time talking to. They're almost evenly divided between men and women. They are, many of them are high school graduates, but not all. Some have some college, but I don't think anyone had attained a college degree per se, other than maybe AA degree, 2-year degree. Tell us a little bit about who are these people that you spent time talking to and trying to understand.
And I will say that although several, indeed many, almost half took some community college classes, there were actually no graduates with AA degrees in the sample. But having said that, I very specifically define the population of people that I talk to as the engaged impoverished. But I mean engaged, they almost all had work histories. These are not people that have been chronically or substantially removed from the world of work. They had jobs. I encountered them in a job training center that was attached to Washington Community College. So they were in spaces where they had access to the class in Washington Community College. They were seeking assistance in making their lives better. So there was a certain kind of agentic component to who these people were, right? They had work histories, interested in making life better for themselves. In many ways, coming into this project was an opportunity for them to figure out what might be of help to them or what insight they could get from the research experience that will enable them to trying to get ahead. They were also long-term residents of Ypsilanti and very much familiar with and comfortable with that city as home. It's a space they understood. It's a space they felt comfortable navigating. They were very clear about what was different about Ann Arbor in comparison to where they lived, what was different about Detroit, even though there were still, again, moments of economic and cultural connection. So a very clear sense of where they lived and who they were, but in some ways, a very strong sense that they weren't very much recognized. So they would argue that the story of Southeastern Michigan for people that are not from that area is Detroit. Mm-hmm. And occasionally Flint may pop up due to the Michael Moore movies, some other spaces may garner attention, but this was not a space where they felt the world necessarily understood them or even knew they were there. Mm-hmm. So they were trying to make a life for themselves, get on with what they thought they could do in a space that didn't register in the minds of others as all that significant.
There are many aspects of this book that I love, but one of the aspects that I love the most is that you get to actually meet the people. That sometimes in scholarly texts, we synthesize and flatten out who the individuals are. And while you provide pseudonyms, they get to speak for themselves. And in their own words and rhythms and utterances, you get a little sense of that. How did you decide to allow them to speak for themselves?
Well, that is in large part a common way in which I go about research. I found that for the African American experience more generally, for African Americans in working class and low income contexts more specifically, there's often a lot of scholarly debate about them, a lot of reporting on them, much less engagement of the population. And
Yeah.
so I actually came to research wanting to hear people tell their stories and wanting to hear how they work through the often dichotomized depictions of people. Well, we believe in America or we don't. We're working hard or we're not. Things will work out in the end or they won't. Well, most people live in between those boundaries.
Yeah.
And the stories they tell about how they live between those boundaries, I think is important. So I very much, with Ypsilanti residents, with people I've studied more generally, wanted them to account for how they saw the social world, how they approached obstacles, concerns, barriers, how they interpreted social reality. And for me, the project is not so much are they right or are they accurate or do they share my worldview, but what is their worldview?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that ground their understandings of possibilities, opportunities, and challenges? So their voices matter. There's no research agenda for me without committing to trying to capture their voices.
So here you are, professor at the University of Michigan, coming in and trying to get them to talk to you, to get people to trust you to open up, because it still requires some element of trust on the part of those in the community. I remember years ago when I was first at the University of Michigan before I left for a long stint and came back. I was in Detroit and we were engaged in a conversation with community leaders of various sorts. I had organized a whole group of deans to go into Detroit and talk to these community leaders. And one person looked and said, look, we need to educate you. And I said, okay, tell us what we need to know. And she said, we're tired of being the objects of your study. In some ways, we want to be the co-authors of your studies. And so we want to figure out how, in effect, we gain a voice in what you're doing and how you're sort of telling the world about us. And so how did you go about getting people to open up?
Okay, well, some of this may be counterintuitive, but I'll start by saying, and this part actually is not counterintuitive, I try to connect with people who I already know or who I feel can be points of connection to other people. And so again, frequenting Ypsilanti a little bit, getting to know some people, it was very easy for me to pick up the phone and say, here's a project I want to pursue. I'm going to bring a team of graduate students with me to get these interviews done. There were 103 people, so more than I could do myself. Can you help me find people to talk to or put me in contact with people that could put me in contact with the people that I want to talk to? And you know, some of the points of connection don't pan out. That's okay. It so happened that several people were instrumental in connecting me to many Ypsilanti residents. One, I sort of say the unsung hero of this work, a gentleman named Anthony Williamson, who works with Ypsilanti Public Housing Commission, who upon meeting me and hearing my story said, I got you.
I also will say that I love doing these things live because you never know exactly what's going to happen. So for those of us who are over a certain decade, remember live TV and things that would happen in the middle of a script. And so this is our version of live TV. And my guess is Professor Young is rebooting at the moment and will rejoin us.
Earl, were there any stories that really stuck with you in the book, or particular parts of the narrative?
There were several stories, and I was actually going to ask Al about this because when I read the book in manuscript when he was first doing it, I said there's this fascinating way in which several of the stories to me seem to actually address the issue of going back to the future, where people were yearning for a world that their grandparents had had, working for Ford or GM, and when the industrial order provided a certain kind of security. for working people all over the United States, and where you were putting your time, you would get your union wage, you would have health insurance, you may have enough money to buy a little place up north somewhere. You could imagine retirement and all of those things. And this book was striking in a lot of ways, because what happened is that these were people all working. Some had 3 jobs. They were working at the same time. Some had a side hustle in addition to the 2 or 3 jobs. But they were people who believed in the possibility of work in America. But yet they also yearned for a world that was not coming back. And that was this interesting then dislocation between knowing about a world and sensing it, but you had a relative who still worked for Ford, or a relative who still worked at GM. As one of Al's participants in the book said, now she looked at factory work and she saw that and how it broke down her mother and broke down her father. And she said, I never want to do that. But I want, in some ways, the security that went with working in those settings. And so there's this interesting way in reading the book and in talking with Al, there is a part about Back to the Future. I mean, and this is a question not just for Ypsilanti, but where the extrapolation is Ypsilanti for the rest of the country, where all over the country, there are folks who are pining for, in some ways, a world that we won't return to, notwithstanding what politicians have said in election cycles in great numbers. We just know that we won't. And so—
Not coming back.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me, I went back and reread Studs Terkel, the great Chicago writer, in his massive 1970-something book called Working. And what that book reminded me powerfully is, if you read it, half the people in that book, and there are like 700, 800 people he's talking to, hated their jobs. All 800 of them loved the fact that they had a job. I mean, and it's this interesting, right, ways in which people say, I may hate some aspects of it, but I love having this job. And so therein lies both the challenge and the opportunity. There's Al. In the middle, technology, it can be our friend and our foe at any given moment.
It is indeed tonight. I apologize. A gust of wind came and then I was gone.
One of the questions I was going to lead into, Al, is the perception of Ann Arbor on the part of a number of residents of Ypsi, as you outline and describe it in the book.
Indeed, and this was one of the real jewels of the research project, because having invested in large cities for most of my career, I had a bunch of false assumptions about what it would mean to study a place that was so close to Ann Arbor. And in the course of the field research, hearing so many people talk about Ann Arbor as if though it was a foreign place. You know, this location, the interview site, was less than a 10-minute drive from my office, from my home in Ann Arbor. And I encountered so many people that said, Ann Arbor is not a comfortable place for me. Whether it's the research community that feels different than a person like me that works in a different sector, that's lived a different life, whether it's perceptions of racial difference. And what that conveyed for me is a very clear indication that geography matters, but not in the way that we think it does. Mm-hmm. That people's social experiences, their patterns of exposure, their personal histories really create for them a sense of what's familiar, what's different, what spaces they can inhabit, what spaces are threatening. And we've got to tend to that as researchers, we've got to tend to that as community-minded individuals to understand the possibilities for bringing people together across boundaries. So these places so close together, for the African Americans I studied, a world far apart. And in many ways, they felt culturally connected to Detroit. They felt that Detroit sounded like a more familiar place, even though it was farther away. Yet Ann Arbor, this distant, unfamiliar place that more importantly, wasn't perceived by them to be as welcoming.
Yeah. And this raises profoundly critical social policy questions as we look to the next decade or two, as we think about the continued deindustrialization of America, but also the rapid automation of America. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. and that we take just McKinsey as an example, and the studies that they had over the last decade that project somewhere between 39 and 54 million Americans will lose their jobs due to automation by 2030. And you think, okay, and that's a sizable number. And as they also note, this is not evenly distributed across populations and communities. And so to have this major institution and this sort of city pointing to a new world, looking off-putting, raises interesting questions on the social policy side. I know my time with you is almost up, but I don't know if you have one or two thoughts there about, is there a way that this university and the city of Ann Arbor can partner in a new way to suggest that indeed the future hinges on a new realization of who's included and who's not?
Well, I think some very careful partnerships are in order. First of all, realizing what it means to come from an environment where research and technology is a given. It is what has established Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan in particular, to be the places that they are. But to understand that the personal histories, the experiences of other people aren't constructed in the same way. There is confusion, concern, not always stutter anxiety, but confusion or concern is enough to not understand the moments of connection. I caution that people on the Ann Arbor side be very careful about thinking that they can jump into Ypsilanti with all the answers.
Yeah.
And try to appear to Ypsilanti residents as saviors. There's got to be a conversation, because what goes on in Ypsilanti matters to those residents. It's important for them. And so the lesson on the Ann Arbor side is to approach with caution and care. You know, and indeed, one of our co-sponsors, the Ann Arbor YMCA, is the model of that, and stepping into Ypsilanti, but trying to do so from the perspective of what do Ypsilanti residents want? What might seem to them to be the way in which we build healthy communities. And I think that that's the lesson that we have. As much expertise, knowledge as the research and tech side of the divide have, we must be cautious in going into new communities.
Well, I know that your colleagues here have things they want to say and questions that they want to pose and answers they want to offer. And so with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, and I think Carl is here, Professor Carl O'Connor, who is going to take over this next period of moderating a conversation among the three of you. And you know,
I received a note that she's still trying to connect. Of community relations for the Washington County Sheriff's Office, comes out of a background of social work training and a great deal of community work. He has done a tremendous amount to try to bridge the gap in our communities and really standing in between these very different spaces. The Herman and Amelie Associate Dean for Research and Policy Engagement at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and the Director of Poverty Solutions here at the University of Michigan. Dr. Schaefer is not simply a scholar with a deep and profound perspective on poverty, but a product of Ypsilanti himself, and so brings the personal as well as the intellectual experience to our opportunity for conversation this evening. I'd like to ask both to just comment very briefly about your perspective on Ypsilanti. I know you've each had distinct relationships with the city, and it will help us to know in your own words, what does Ypsilanti mean to you? And I'll ask Derek to go first.
Sure, I'll jump on in there. I think, so, you know, thanks for having me on here tonight to talk about this. And I just want to say that the book to me was phenomenal for a number of different reasons, but it was already brought up this idea, this notion of just listening to people and letting the people say what Ypsilanti really is and what their perspective is, I think is so invaluable. But for me, you know, I've been here for over 20 years. I raised my daughter here. I come from a community in Wayne County, Inkster, which is not dissimilar from Ypsilanti. It's closer to Detroit, but in some ways, Ypsi felt like home. So when I came to school here at Eastern Michigan University and then grad school at U of M, I felt like Ypsi was home. And so I decided to, you know, spend my time here and raise my family here. The other part is, you know, I worked with young people when I worked at a homeless shelter. So I was working with folks and families who were in poverty for the beginning of my professional career. And so you really combine my kind of personal experiences back home in Inkster, which felt like home here in Ypsi, with some of the work that I was doing with, I'm guessing, some of the same families or the same kind of issues that those families were facing back at my Ozone House days. It just felt like the place to be. So for me, what is Ypsi? Ypsi's home. It really, really is. It's a comfort level. I love the community I live in. And so now in the work that I do now with law enforcement and getting to be the face of a law enforcement agency, I get a lot of people that ask me, why do you still live in Ypsi? Like I get that every once in a while. And I just say, well, why not? Number one, but number two, like, and this is the part of the book that I really love the most, Al, was you touched on the comfort level for people who live in Ypsi, for Black folks in particular who live in Ypsi, versus the discomfort in Ann Arbor. I tell people all the time that I feel more comfortable in Ypsi than I did in Ann Arbor for a long time. Even when I was in grad school there, I would get on the bus to go to class. I get right on the bus and come back home to Ypsi. And so some of that stuff still lingers. And so that's really my connection to Ypsi. I also just wanted to say one other piece on the perspective of it. And I like how you worded when you say the city kind of caught in between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And the work that I do, I get to see it caught in between Detroit and Ann Arbor in a different way. So oftentimes when you're trying to work with families who are struggling, we get overlooked in Ypsi because Detroit, right? Detroit sucks up all the resources and the research when people are thinking about families that are really struggling or poverty. And then on the other end, because we're so close to Ann Arbor and Ann Arbor changes the dynamic in the conversation, sometimes we get overlooked because Ann Arbor or Washington County wins the awards for some of the best places to raise your kids and, all those kinds of things. So really it's this weird dichotomy to be stuck in between a city of Detroit and Ann Arbor that I think you embark upon in some of your writing, but also I think even beyond that, there's some other dynamics at play here that really get Ypsi caught in the middle. And I should just say that I live in Ypsi Township. And I know people will say Ypsi City and Ypsi Township are separate, but for many people, it's one and the same. The township surrounds the city, and they're very similar culturally and feel to both. And I'll end there.
Luke, by all means, jump in, and then I will introduce Dr. O'Connell.
Thanks, Al. I've been a big fan of Al for a long time, and I was really excited a few years ago when he told me he was working on a project on Ypsilanti. And a lot of that was driven by my personal connection to the city. So my family had a hardware store on Michigan Avenue for 80 plus years called, creatively we called it Schaefer Hardware. My great-grandfather started it, my grandfather ran it, my father ran it. And in a lot of ways, I think it was, it fell victim to a lot of the same dynamics that Al, you were talking about a bit, and Earl was talking about just in terms of the restructuring of the economy. Big box stores coming in and the local hardware store really not being able to compete. And I think a lot of the time of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti as being siblings, maybe brothers or maybe sisters, maybe they're cousins. And really the stories of the economy being of the nation as a microcosm of the two cities, where the industrial sort of jobs that feature prominently in the book are on the decline, and the sort of the high-tech knowledge economy, the rewards getting even greater. And so cities sort of split apart over that time. And my family sort of course, follows that trajectory a little bit, where my grandparents were running a hardware store, and now, I'm a professor at U of M. I would just say, I run the Center of Poverty Solutions, and we've talked, we do a number of programs in Washtenaw County. And I'd be would love to talk about those more. Partially, one of our programs was inspired by the sheriff of Washtenaw County, Derek's boss. But I think at the start, I just want to say that this book was, the thing that has haunted me about this book is the reflections on Ann Arbor. And I know you've all brought it up, and I think it's, I think it's kind to Ann Arbor to say that many of the respondents in your book view it as an uncomfortable place. So, one of the passages that really struck with me was Carmen. So Carmen is 22 years old. She lives alone. She attended college, and she writes about Ann Arbor. She says, "I don't care what nobody says. Ann Arbor is one of the most prejudiced cities, other than like Howell, Michigan." So she's comparing Ann Arbor to Howell. Because it's a college town on top of that, you could be going to the university and they walk into a store and they still just treat you different. They watch you, like acting like they're not watching, but they are watching. And it's like, I'm not gonna steal anything. I'm about to pay for that. They're very prejudiced. So, and Ann Arbor sort of appears all throughout this book, and it's not pretty. It really, I think, is any Ann Arbor resident that wants to understand our town, this will give you a lens into how our neighbors, right next door, many view the city. And so to me, it's really a call to action to try to figure out these things. So we've talked about like Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan, how we could approach doing work in Ypsilanti. And I hope this book can act as a way for us to say, how do we do the work in Ann Arbor? How do we make it not just like a more inviting place, right? How do we make it a less hostility filled place? How do we, in the signals that Ann Arborites are sending a lot of the time, purposefully and also unpurposefully. And so for me, a lot of the lens gets sort of the descriptions of the narratives of the people that you write about are incredibly rich, and I learn a lot about them. But the lens in terms of like, what is the problem in this story, for me, just sort of gets reverted right back to my hometown and wanting to figure out better ways to address that, so that more Ypsilantians could come and feel comfortable, and frankly, more people of color would want to come to the city of Ann Arbor and make it home.
Thank you so much. The person with the real powerful questions has been able to rejoin us. I take this evening as an example of the fact that even if Ann Arbor is high tech and research, technology can fail some of its residents. So we're not always as on top of things as we'd like to be. But that being the case, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Carla O'Connor to the conversation and to continue facilitating the conversation. She's Arthur Thurnau Professor of Education in the University of Michigan School of Education, where she's built a career over the study of African-American youth identity, and academic achievement, but has more recently become the director of Wolverine Pathways, which is a college readiness initiative that is centered in Detroit, Southfield, and Ypsilanti, and targets high school students, well, actually elementary school and high school students, inviting them into opportunities to learn the skills and abilities that will enable them to be college ready and hopefully ready for the University of Michigan in particular. Dr. O'Connor, I turn over to you. You on mute?
Good evening, everybody. Sorry for my delay in joining you, but hopefully we won't have any more wind blowing in my area and disconnections as such. I'd like to start by thinking about Al's discussion of how the automobile plant and the auto industry more generally provided a staple for employment in Southeast Michigan. At the city of Detroit, and clearly was critical of the small city of Ypsilanti. And what I'd like our panelists to speak to is, what do you think can or needs to be done to rebuild vibrant employment sectors for the kinds of people in Al's book?
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in. One of the things, and I think it does tie back into a little bit of the conversation we were having around this disconnect between how comfortable people feel in Ann Arbor or don't feel comfortable in Ann Arbor. Some of it is accepting people and not looking at and saying Ipsy or the other, right? Like poverty for me, I grew up poor. Poor is what made me who I am. Right. And so I don't look at Al's book as highlighting something negative. I look at Al's book as just highlighting the realities of the block and what it is. And so for me, it is those trials and tribulations of growing up in poverty that gave me the courage, the resilience, the creativity to move beyond. And so when I work with folks, whether they're in Ipsy or any other place, what I'm really looking at is what are the competencies that they have, right? And so they don't need the college degree to be the best person for the job. And I do think that in our, we're one of the most educated counties in Michigan. And so we have two very large learning institutions here. And so I know by default, a lot of people go back to the college degree or the diploma, but I also will say that there's a lot of research out there around the diversity of thought. There's a lot of expertise in the communities, and I would argue that in some of the folks that Al had dealt with. And so I think seeing the value in that, I think is really, really important. On the flip side of that, though, it is about us in our communities talking broader. Al, I think you worded as around having a limited image of self or having a limited, imagination to really see what is possible. For me personally, it wasn't until I was a track runner, but I got to go on a trip to Australia as a junior in high school. And that trip to Australia literally changed my paradigm and perspective, because prior to that, my world was the block. It was, as the folks would describe in Al's book, in her stories, they really seen their world as this limited space. Once I ventured out of that and my perspective was widened, I did see different possibility. And so I guess I would just say that, you don't know what you don't know. And it is, for us, the courage to venture into Ann Arbor, I think, is important. I have to force myself sometimes to do that. So I would just say that I think it's a two-way street for folks not to pass judgment because someone is from a particular community, but also for those folks in that community to have the courage to really step up and have some of those different experiences. I think is really, really important. I just wanted to touch on one key piece. The lack of imagination, I think, is one part of it, but it's also the individual and the social context. I just want to point out that, Washtenaw County, and by default Ann Arbor, because it's our largest city, is one of the most economically segregated counties in America. It is one of the most difficult places to rise out of poverty, from if you're born poor to have that upward mobility. So I do think that some of it is racialized, some of it is economics, but not to really pass over the fact that for all of the good in our county, those are two very distinct measures that I think really speak to what's the underlying and undertone, maybe behind some of the sentiment and the feelings of not being welcome in Ann Arbor that some of the individuals that Al shared the story about.
So Luke, building upon or speaking to some of the things Derek said, you wrote a book, Living on Almost Nothing in America, right? That was its subtitle. And we know that the automobile industry provided a living wage. With that having been pretty much decimated, how do you think about what it would mean at this point in time to revitalize employment sectors when we think about Ypsilanti and when we think about pushing people to imagine possibilities? What possibilities might there be for them to imagine?
Yeah, great question. And I'm just going to pick up on a theme that Earl was discussing about this sort of idea of back to the future and the yearning for stability. And I think that really comes out really strongly, this idea that I want a stable job. And I was, as he was talking about that, I was reflecting on this survey data I saw recently of Americans. So it's a nationally representative sample, and it said, do you prefer economic policies that promote social mobility or financial stability? So policies that help you move up the ladder or help you stay stable. And I was utterly shocked that 90% of Americans picked financial stability, right? This notion that I want a safety net and I want to know that I'm not going to fall. And then I can live my life sort of in the productive ways that I want really matters to people. And that's what we lost, right? With these jobs, with manufacturing jobs. And I remember having a conversation with Dan Kildee years ago, who's now a congressman out of Flint. And he was saying, when he said he was going to the University of Michigan in the 1970s, his family thought he was crazy. They're like, what are you doing? That's such a terrible financial decision. You can get a job at the GM plant and you'll be making X number of dollars and you'll get a house with a pool. And how quickly, things change. So I, as Earl said, as much as I wish those jobs were coming back, I don't think they are. right? And we do know that I think the jobs of the future, even the lower wage jobs, they're going to be jobs that require like use of technology. And so that's a place that we should be sort of putting our human capital training at whatever level that we're talking about. And it can't just be to like learn a program, right? Or learn how to do something. It's got to be training for adaptability. And that sort of goes against the stability thing, right? Where we're like, the job market, we're not only going to lose jobs to technology, but everything's going to change all the time from here, on out, as far as I can tell. So what can we do? Two things I think we can do is a lot more to make the safety net more of a safety net than it actually is, right? So I know in my field, we've had some actually big and positive advances in anti-poverty policy, but they're not really safety nets. We have refundable tax credits that as you earn more, the benefit gets bigger. And if your earnings fall to zero, you get zero. And then we have programs that as you earn more, you lose your benefits right away. And so I've been a big proponent of saying, let's make a safety net that actually stabilizes people and it can be depended on in a way. So let's try to even out the labor market. And then the other interesting thing is questions about wages, right? As you just raised. And I'm just struck by the fact that Florida voted for Donald Trump for president, and also voted for a referendum to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour to the tune of 65%. So 65% of Floridians voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And, I hang out with enough economists to know that there's some concerns about what happens with the minimum wage, but I think it speaks to the fact that Americans believe in policies that say, if you work, you should get paid enough to do right by your family. At wide numbers, it's not even close, right? And so thinking more about what are the levers of government and how can we work with businesses to sort of even out the instability that really seems like it's here to stay.
Now, one of the other things that Al talks about substantively in his book are gender distinctions and how Black Americans, particularly those in Ypsilanti, not only make sense of contemporary challenges, but possibilities with regards to the world of work. And right now we've thought about imagining possibilities and safety nets and what constitutes a good job and how do we think about wages. How do you think gender matters to these and other issues as we look to improve the prospects of working people?
Maybe I'll start this one and then kick it over to Derek. I think gender matters like a great deal actually in this particular sphere. It turns out we have some sectors of the economy that really are growing, right? And we have a hard time finding workers for. And some of that is because the wages are low, but some of it is the gendering of it. So thinking of like home healthcare and a lot of jobs that people sort of explicitly think of as being work that's predominantly done by women. And we actually do have a lot of trouble like convincing men to like do the trainings and do the work to take those jobs, right? And so that we kind of have to have a reckoning on that. And wrapped up in that, of course, is the flip side. So a lot of the sectors of the economy that are sort of gendered and people sort of associate with women are growing, and men sort of have a difficult time sort of signing up for those. And we have to think about that. We also have to think about like the wage gap, right? That because those jobs are sort of gendered for women, they tend to get paid less. They definitely get paid less than they're worth. And, we've seen some improvements in the wage gap over the last couple decades, but it's still quite persistent. It's still quite large. And so thinking about how do we even that out as well is sort of a piece of the puzzle. So really reconceptualizing who does what work and sort of moving beyond that. I don't know how to do it, but it is going to be an important part of the future.
Derek, you bring multiple vantage points from your embeddedness in Ypsilanti, your work as a social worker, your work in law enforcement. How do you think about gender in relation to the issues raised in Al's book and thinking about work opportunity.
Yeah, again, I think one of the most important pieces of Al's book is he just listened and gave voice to the people who were the subject in the study, right? And so I think they said it really, really clear. And there's a number of different examples that I wrote down of people overwhelmingly, except for I think one woman who agreed that, yep, there's a distinction there. I think let's just think about it. I mean, when you think about negativity, when you think about crime, when you think about poverty, what's the face that comes to mind? Black men. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of theory behind all of this, but let's just talk about the reality and what the people in the book were really trying to get us to understand, which is there is a distinction. Many times Black men are seen as thugs, I think is what someone, or hoodlums is what was the terms that were used in the book. And I think that's just the reality. When you look on the nightly news, what do you see? I guess part of why I wanted to be a part of this discussion too is just in that, like, how do we change that narrative? And it isn't just that Black men themselves need to change their narrative. How do we as community members change that narrative? So why is it that the face of Black children is the face of, you know, poverty, so to speak? I mean, there's some rationale there, right? Like you are more likely, the ratio of, you know, being Black in America to be poor. But what about the alternatives? If it is just about ratios, then why aren't Black folks the face of patriotism? Because we are overrepresented in the military, right? Why aren't Black families the face of philanthropy? We give a higher percentage of our wealth to philanthropic organizations than other races by far. And so if we're talking about playing it equal, I think we really need to look at some of these biases that really get called out in the book. And although they share it through their stories, I think what they were saying is just racism is real. And there is a distinction between Black men and Black women. That was not surprising to me, but I think refreshing in a way that, again, Al gives that voice. And so people who read it can say, wow, even amongst the Black community of poor folks in Ypsi who are going through many similar struggles, they very clearly see that Black men are looked upon negatively. And it does make it harder to find employment and things of that nature.
So Derek, you pose an important challenge, one of how do you change the narrative? So I'm going to throw it back to you. How do you imagine we change that narrative? And then I'll ask Luke the same thing.
Well, I think a part of it is, so I'm a part of My Brother's Keeper. So I use my examples, washing on My Brother's Keeper. And so one of the things we're trying to do is change that narrative, but it's really about building ourselves up. So giving ourselves spaces. This is another thing that I think is important when you think about the Ann Arbor Ypsi dichotomy. Where are the Black spaces? And I know Al alluded to that some in the book. Where are those spaces for people to feel comfortable around one another, to grow, to share stories, to help give information on to the next generation in a positive way? And so one is just that, growing within ourselves, but then also being involved in things. You know, there's a program here around Black Men Reads, and I'll never forget the story around, it's really all it is Black men reading to elementary age kids. And one of the young men who was reading, the first thing he said was, well, the first class I went into, it was all white elementary students. And I was like, I'm here to, you know, read to Black kids. And what he realized at the time though, because all these white kids came to him and started hugging him afterwards. And what he realized was it wasn't just about changing the perspective of young Black men in this case. It was really about changing the perspective even of young white children or how they see Black men. So part of it is just that, us understanding ourselves and being courageous enough to step outside of those traditional boxes. And the last story I'll share, I worked with a kid before, and we would do these time to shines. And so we would give a young person at Ozone House 30 minutes to come in and teach us about themselves. They could teach whatever they wanted about themselves. And we just had to be quiet and listen. And one young man came in. He's a big high school, he's a Black kid. He's a big high school football player from Ypsi High back then. And he came in and he says, you know, I love opera music. And some of the kids started to laugh at him. What you talking about? And I thought he was just making a joke. And then he started to pull out of his backpack all of these CDs at the time of opera. And he says, my grandmother loved opera music and taught me to love opera music. And he started to teach us about opera music. Now, even for us, I was doing this good work of trying to help young people express themselves. And even I had this box that I was putting this young African-American man in that he was trying to break out of. And so I think a part of that challenge is really internal for us to allow our young men to step outside those boxes.
So turning next to you, Luke, are there ways you imagine changing the narratives, or alternatively, are there other narratives that need to shift? So Derek outlined some narratives we're struggling with that are biased against Black men, but are there other narratives to be considered? And if so, how do we change them?
Yeah, I think it starts with just telling different stories, right? And I think all of Derek's examples were really great ones of we're telling different stories by what we do and how we do it and the stories that we lift up. And then I think we need to change the storytellers. So one way of doing that is a book like Al's, that where he spends his time sort of not going in. He wasn't even going into the place he thought he was going to be studying, right? He was going in, he was asking questions, and he got captivated, right? He got captivated by a set of guys who were men and women who were telling him things about the world that he didn't know, right? That such a large fraction of African Americans don't live in central cities, but live in these small, small size cities, right? And that opened up a whole different world for him. And I think it's also a matter of changing the storyteller. So we're doing a lot of work at Poverty Solutions of trying to be co-partners with community organizations that we work with, not just to go in and ask them what they're, thinking about and what's going on in their communities, but to do more and more to try to invite them to tell those stories themselves and try to figure out how do we act as someone who can sort of help create the platforms for that. And then, finally, I think to me, there's a part with this story of like, how do we change the narrative of turning the lens, right? So all of this focus on young Black men, right? Just as Derek said, and problematizing that, and maybe we just sort of shift the lens around and figure out who are the people and who are the institutions that are a big part of the cause of where people are, right? And what about white supremacy? How does it work? And what do people do? And how do you really combat it, right? So trying to think not so much about sort of the actions of a set of people, but the actions of a different set of people who are sort of like causing so much of the problem. And so that is a story, right? I think of like a change in the lexicon in the last decade, I would say, in popular reference of talking about slaves versus talking about people who were enslaved, right? And how important that was to me anyways, to sort of realize, oh, we need to be, this was an action, right? It's not like this was an identity. And so turning the lens to me and sort of recognizing all the things that are a part of the story that get missed seems like it's just going to be a really important piece of the puzzle.
So we only have a few minutes left, and in some ways you provided a wonderful segue, Luke, in terms of what's been missed. So, and I'd like each of you to take up this question. So what have we missed in our discussion today, whether we're thinking about how to imagine possibilities for Ypsilanti residents in the world of work, solutions we have not considered, challenges that we need to take up? So any of your parting thoughts on those things or other things you think are important takeaways? Derek, would you like to start?
Yeah, I was going to give Luke an opportunity to jump in first. That's a good question. What have we missed? I think we've covered a lot. I'll just say I personally, as someone who grew up in a certain environment that is very similar to Ipsy and now have raised my daughter here, I think, and again, this is why I was reading Al's book with a keen eye for this. It wasn't a negative thing about poverty. It just was what it was. And I think that's a really important piece. I know that there are challenges to poverty. Yes, when I was young, I wish we would have had more food and more resources. So don't get me wrong when I say this, but also I think we should recognize the strength and the resilience that it builds in folks and some of the positives that come from it. I had a track coach. He was an older white man at Eastern Michigan, and he was one of the great coaches of all time. And I would always ask him, how do you get all of these young inner city Black kids to come run for you? And he was one of the first, because he'd been around Eastern for years, to actually have Black folks on a college university team. And he really talked about this resilience, right? Like, once you give someone a piece of the table or a piece of the pie, especially folks who have had to struggle in certain ways, they're never going to let go of it. And so some of our hardest workers where I work at now, some of our rock stars are people who come from these communities. And I just want to remind folks of that piece of it, that yes, there are challenges, but there's also, I think, a certain level of resilience and skill that gets molded into something beautiful. I always say that I learned much more from the block than I ever did in a college classroom. Some good things, some not so good things. But I think it really prepared me to be the person that I am today. So that's just one thing I wanted to highlight, is just the positives that also come along with some of those struggles.
And Luke, if you could share your parting thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of tell a quick story about a program we run. So Derek's boss, Sheriff Clayton, a couple of years ago really started championing a summer youth jobs program in Washtenaw County. And the county and Michigan Works started that, and Poverty Solutions became a partner in that. So the last couple of years, we've housed 40 to 50 summer jobs. And one of the important decisions we make is that we really focus our recruitment in the lowest income zip codes of Washtenaw County, which happen to be in Ypsi, but it's also universally available, right? So that it's not a program that's just targeting low income kids, but sort of disproportionate focus there. And, we did the first year. We were really happy with it. We thought everybody liked it. And a couple insights came in. One, we felt like the supervisors that are all across campus, we have placements in ISR, in childcare, in buildings and grounds. The supervisors felt like they got maybe as much out of it as the youth that were working in the jobs. They're working about 20 hours a week for about 8 weeks. The second was that the youth liked the program. They liked coming on campus for a job, not just because the university sort of deigned to let them come. It was a job. They were doing work, but they hated being associated with something called Poverty Solutions. So that was an example where that name was not well received. And that was just really, great feedback for us, where the next year we just stripped the name off of the program. So it's now Summer Works, and we're a part of it, but we would never use that name because it's not something that works for them. And there's been a couple of funny experiences where people will say, hey, you guys should find out about the Summer Works program, and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, that's actually us. But that's okay. And it continues to be a learning process, right? I imagine we're going to continue to get back evaluations. And I know, in your work too, you may have this experience too with Wolverine Pathways of like just continuing to try to improve it and recognizing we're going to make mistakes as we go along. But if we listen, we can just build and deepen our relationships by being responsive to those things.
So we've more than gone beyond our time. I want to thank both Luke and Derek for their really provocative commentary, the way it helped us sort of illuminate not only the themes in Al's book, but had us think more substantively about the challenges and possibilities of the Ypsilanti community and how that is situated within broader challenges and opportunities, many of which we are dealing with in the current moment. I want to remind the audience that there will be opportunities for continued discussion and feedback through the blog post, so your questions will be answered in that space. And I want to thank you for joining us for this special event. And last but not least, I want to give us a second shout out and appreciation for our sponsors, namely the National Center for Institutional Diversity, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, the Department of Sociology, and the Ann Arbor YMCA. Thank you for joining us for this event, and I hope that you will continue the discussions thereafter.
Thank you, everyone, as well. I'm grateful
Thank
for your
you. It's a
investment of
pleasure.
time in this effort.